The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut, echoing like a gunshot through the penthouse. Abigail stood trembling, her soft, thick curves wrapped in a cheap trench coat that suddenly felt paper-thin. Across the sprawling desk sat Matteo Bianchi, a man whose tailored Tom Ford suit couldn't hide the predator underneath. He slid a thick dossier across the glass, leaning back with a chilling, arrogant smile. "I bought your father's debt," the smug Mafia Boss announced, his dark eyes trailing over her full figure with a dangerous glint. "And now, you belong to me." Abigail Brooks was not the kind of woman who blended into the background. At 26, she was pragmatic, fiercely intelligent, and carried her 240-pound frame with an unapologetic, quiet grace. She was a woman who took up space in a world that constantly told her to shrink. Working as a senior forensic auditor for a mid-sized accounting firm in Midtown Manhattan, she spent her days untangling the financial messes of wealthy, careless men. But absolutely nothing in her meticulous, spreadsheet-driven life could have prepared her for the catastrophic ruin her own father, Arthur Brooks, had invited into their lives. Arthur was a man of grand, foolish dreams. His company, Brooks Logistics, had been struggling for years, crippled by supply chain issues and his own chronic gambling addiction. Abigail knew things were tight. She had bailed him out of 2 mortgages and surrendered her own savings to keep his payroll afloat. What she didn't know was that Arthur had bypassed the banks entirely for his latest bailout. He had gone to Aegis Financial Holdings, a shadow lending firm in the financial district that operated as a legitimate front for the Bianchi crime syndicate. It was a brutally wet Tuesday evening in November when Abigail's world fractured. She had rushed to her father's office in Queens after receiving a frantic, breathless voicemail. The rain lashed against her umbrella as she navigated the cracked pavement of the industrial park. Her wet slacks clung to her thick thighs, and her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When she pushed open the frosted glass door of Brooks Logistics, the usual hum of dispatchers was dead. The office was empty, save for the dim light spilling from Arthur's private suite at the back. Abigail marched down the hallway, her wet boots squeaking on the linoleum. "Dad?" she called out, her voice echoing in the silence. She rounded the corner and stopped dead. Arthur Brooks was on his knees. The 60-year-old man, usually so proud and stubborn, was weeping into his hands, his face pale and slick with terror. Standing over him, examining a brass paperweight with casual, terrifying indifference, was Matteo Bianchi. Matteo was a ghost story whispered in the boardrooms and back alleys of New York. At 32, he had inherited the Bianchi empire and transformed it from a street-level mob into a sophisticated, multi-billion-dollar enterprise. He was devastatingly handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features, jet-black hair, and eyes as cold and unforgiving as deep water. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that hugged his broad shoulders, radiating an aura of absolute, unchecked power. 2 massive men in dark suits stood by the door, their hands resting ominously inside their jackets. "Ah," Matteo murmured, tossing the paperweight onto Arthur's desk with a heavy thud. He turned his gaze to Abigail. His eyes swept over her, taking in her rain-dampened hair, her flushed, round cheeks, and the generous curve of her hips and bust beneath her soaked trench coat. Unlike most men who looked at her with either dismissal or fetishized curiosity, Matteo's gaze was calculating, heavy, and undeniably possessive. "The daughter arrives. Abigail, I presume." "Who are you?" Abigail demanded, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the violent shaking of her hands. She stepped forward, deliberately placing her plush, formidable body between the dangerous stranger and her weeping father. "What is going on here? Dad, get up!" "Abby, please," Arthur sobbed, not moving an inch. "Don't make him angry. You don't understand what I've done." "I am Matteo Bianchi," the man said, sliding his hands into his pockets. He stepped closer, invading Abigail's personal space. The scent of him, expensive cedar, bergamot, and a faint metallic trace of something that smelled like ozone, washed over her. "Your father has a habit of making promises he cannot keep, Miss Brooks. Specifically, to the tune of $6.8 million. Money he borrowed from my associates under the guise of expanding this pathetic excuse for a logistics company. Money he instead lost at underground baccarat tables run by a man named Jonathan Mercer." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. 6.8 million. It was a death sentence. There was no way out of a debt that size. Her mind raced, her forensic accountant instincts kicking in even as panic threatened to choke her. That's impossible. No legitimate lender would approve that kind of capital without extensive collateral. "You are absolutely right," Matteo smiled, though the gesture was utterly devoid of warmth. It was a smug, predatory smirk. "But we are not a legitimate lender, Abigail. We are the consequences of bad decisions. And your father offered the only collateral he had left." Matteo reached inside his breast pocket and produced a folded legal document. He held it out to her. Hesitantly, Abigail took it. As she read the meticulously typed words, her stomach dropped into an abyss. It was an assignment of debt, a complete transfer of Brooks Logistics assets, and a horrifying secondary clause. The clause stipulated an indentured guarantor. "I bought your father's debt," the smug Mafia Boss announced, his voice dropping to a low, velvety purr that sent a shiver straight down her spine. "And now, you belong to me." "You can't do this," Abigail whispered, clutching the paper so hard her knuckles turned white. "This isn't the 1800s. You can't just claim a human being as collateral. It's illegal. It's slavery. In a court of law? Perhaps," Matteo chuckled, taking another step forward until his chest was merely inches from hers. He looked down at her, his gaze intense. "But we are not in a courtroom, Miss Brooks. We are in my world now. Your father owes me his life. I can have him dismantled piece by piece and dumped in the East River before midnight, and not a single cop in this city would blink. Or you can honor his contract. You come with me. You work for me. You balance my books. You sleep under my roof, and you belong to my family until the debt is paid. The choice is yours." The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the window pane and the pathetic, ragged breathing of Arthur Brooks on the floor. Abigail stared into Matteo Bianchi's dark, fathomless eyes, her brilliant mind frantically searching for a loophole, an exit strategy, anything to wake her from this nightmare. But there was no spreadsheet that could balance a threat to her father's life. "Abby, don't do it," Arthur whimpered, finally finding a shred of his spine. He tried to push himself up, but one of Matteo's men, a massive enforcer with a scarred brow, stepped forward and placed a heavy, punishing hand on the older man's shoulder, forcing him back down. "I'll figure it out. I'll get the money, Bianchi. Just give me a month." "You had 6 months, Arthur," Matteo said softly, not breaking eye contact with Abigail. "Your time expired at 5 o'clock today. I am offering an act of supreme mercy by accepting your daughter in your stead. You should be thanking me." Abigail's breath hitched. She looked at her father, at the deep lines of failure and terror etched into his face. Despite his flaws, despite the sheer, selfish stupidity that had led them here, he was her father. She couldn't let him die. She squared her shoulders, lifting her chin to meet Matteo's gaze. She refused to cower. She was fat, she was exhausted, and she was terrified, but she was not weak. "If I go with you," Abigail said, her voice remarkably steady, "the debt is suspended. You don't touch him. You don't touch his house." "If you come with me," Matteo replied, a flicker of genuine respect crossing his features. "Arthur's ledger is zeroed out. He walks away. But he will never contact you again. He will never seek you out. If he does, the deal is void, and he dies. Do you understand?" "Yes," she said, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. She turned to her father. "Dad, go home." "Abby, go home, Dad," she snapped, her voice cracking with the sheer force of her suppressed emotions. "Don't gamble. Don't borrow. Just exist. Please." Matteo gestured sharply with his hand. The enforcer stepped back, hauling Arthur to his feet and shoving him toward the door. Arthur stumbled, looking back at his daughter with eyes full of a haunting, pathetic guilt, before he practically ran out into the rainy night. "A touching sacrifice," Matteo murmured. "Grab your purse, Abigail. My patience is not infinite." 10 minutes later, Abigail was sitting in the back of a midnight black Maybach, the plush leather interior smelling of rich cedar and danger. Matteo sat beside her, perfectly relaxed, sipping a glass of amber liquid from the car's built-in decanter. He poured a second glass and held it out to her. "Drink," he commanded softly. "You're shaking." She was shaking. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep cold. She took the crystal glass, her plump fingers brushing against his large, calloused hand. A spark of static electricity jumped between them, and she jerked back, splashing a drop of whiskey onto her thigh. "I don't understand," Abigail said, ignoring the drink and staring at him. "Why me? I'm an auditor. I make a decent salary, but nothing that could touch a $7 million debt. And if you wanted someone to abuse, to use as some sort of sick trophy, look at me. I don't fit the profile of a Mafia Boss's captive." Matteo's eyes darkened, and he turned to face her fully in the dim light of the passing street lamps. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then slowly traced the line of her throat, down to the heavy curves of her breasts and the wide flare of her hips pressed against the leather seat. It wasn't a look of disgust. It was a look of consuming, fiery hunger that made Abigail's breath catch in her throat. "You underestimate yourself, Miss Brooks," Matteo said, his voice a low rumble over the purr of the engine. "I don't want a fragile, starving trophy who shatters when the wind blows. I require a woman with substance, a woman with a mind sharp enough to gut my enemies on paper, and a body soft enough to—" He paused, his smirk returning. "Well, we will get to that." Abigail's face burned hot, with a mixture of profound indignation and a bizarre, unbidden thrill. "You're insane." "I am a pragmatist," Matteo corrected, leaning closer. "The truth is, Abigail, I have been watching you for 4 months, long before your father lost that final hand to Mercer. I know about your brilliant work at your firm. I know how you found the $3 million discrepancy in the Vanguard accounts that the SEC missed. My legitimate holding companies are currently under attack by federal regulators. I need someone entirely off the books, someone completely under my control to audit my own men and find the rat bleeding my organization dry." The twist hit her like a physical blow. The debt wasn't a random misfortune. It was a carefully orchestrated trap. "You set him up," she breathed in horror. "You knew he was a gambling addict. You gave him the rope to hang himself so you could get to me." Matteo didn't deny it. He simply smiled, a smug, dark expression that confirmed all her worst fears. I am a businessman, Abigail. I saw an asset I wanted, and I acquired it. And now that you are mine, I expect absolute loyalty. Welcome to the family." As the Maybach crossed the bridge, leaving the borough of Queens behind for the glittering, dangerous skyline of Manhattan, Abigail realized the terrifying truth. She wasn't just collateral. She was the prize. And surviving Matteo Bianchi was going to require every ounce of her formidable intellect, because the physical, gravitational pull of the monster sitting beside her was already threatening to pull her under. The Maybach glided seamlessly into the private underground garage of 56 Leonard Street, the iconic, jagged glass skyscraper in Tribeca, known to Manhattan's elite as the Jenga Tower. Abigail Brooks sat frozen in the supple leather seat, her mind racing through a frantic inventory of her life. Just hours ago, her biggest concern had been a pending tax audit for a mid-level corporate client. Now, she was the captive property of Matteo Bianchi, the ruthless architect of New York's most dangerous crime syndicate. The heavy car door swung open, held by the hulking enforcer who had terrorized her father. Matteo stepped out first, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Tom Ford suit with an air of nonchalant authority. He turned back, offering a large, scarred hand to Abigail. She stared at his outstretched palm, her pulse hammering in her throat. Slowly, deliberately, she bypassed his hand and hauled herself out of the low car, her thick thighs protesting the awkward movement. She adjusted her damp trench coat over her wide hips, lifting her chin to meet his amused gaze. "I can manage my own gravity, Mr. Bianchi," Abigail stated coldly, her voice echoing in the cavernous concrete garage. A slow, devastating smirk spread across Matteo's aristocratic face. "I prefer Matteo, Abigail, and I have no doubt you can manage your gravity. In fact, it's your substantial presence that I find so incredibly fascinating." He didn't say it with the mocking tone she had endured from men her entire life. There was a raw, primal hunger in his dark eyes that made her breath hitch. It was terrifying to be looked at, not as a joke, but as prey. They ascended in a private biometric-locked elevator that opened directly into a sprawling, multi-million-dollar penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the glittering Manhattan skyline, but Abigail hardly noticed. The interior was a masterpiece of cold, brutalist luxury. Dark marble floors, charcoal leather furniture, and stark modern art that looked expensive and entirely devoid of warmth. Matteo led her past the living area and down a long, soundproofed hallway, pushing open double doors to reveal a massive home office. It was a stark contrast to the rest of the penthouse, resembling a high-tech war room. 3 massive curved monitors sat atop a solid mahogany desk, flanked by stacks of encrypted hard drives and towering filing cabinets. "Your new domain," Matteo announced, leaning against the doorframe and watching her take in the room. "The legitimate front, Aegis Financial Holdings, is heavily monitored by FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. We process hundreds of millions through overseas shell companies, primarily out of the Cayman Islands and Cyprus, to wash the cash generated by the syndicate's other ventures." "Money laundering," Abigail said flatly, her professional instincts warring with her moral panic. "You want me to audit your money laundering operation?" "I want you to fix it," Matteo corrected, his voice dropping its playful edge, turning sharp and lethal. 6 weeks ago, my internal accounts began bleeding. Subtle discrepancies, a fraction of a percent here, a ghost transaction there. The SEC is already sniffing around my real estate developments in Hudson Yards, looking for a reason to freeze my assets. Someone inside my inner circle is skimming from the top, cooking the books to make it look like operational losses. Abigail stepped toward the desk, her eyes drifting over the glowing monitors. Despite the sheer terror of her situation, the forensic accountant in her felt a familiar, undeniable pull. A puzzle. A corrupted ledger. This was her language. This was where she was a god. "And your own accountants can't find the leak?" she asked, running a plump finger over the edge of the mahogany desk. "My accountants are terrified of me," Matteo said simply, walking up behind her. He stood close enough that the heat radiating from his massive frame seeped through her damp coat. "They tell me what they think I want to hear. But you, Abigail, you are fighting for your father's life. You have a vested interest in the absolute truth. And as I observed from your brutal, systematic teardown of the Vanguard accounts last year, you are a genius." He reached out, his fingertips lightly grazing the soft curve of her waist. She flinched, but he didn't pull back. Instead, his hand settled firmly on her hip, an anchor of possessive heat. "I will give you full access to the shadow ledgers," Matteo murmured, his breath brushing her ear and sending a violent shiver down her spine. "Find the rat. Give me a name. Do that, and you earn your keep." "And if I refuse?" she whispered, staring blankly at the screens. "You won't," he replied softly. "Because beneath that beautiful soft exterior, you possess a mind that craves order. You hate a broken system, Abigail. You hate a lie on a balance sheet even more than you hate me right now." Over the next 48 hours, Abigail practically lived in that office. She stripped off the damp trench coat and worked in her rumpled slacks and a tight white blouse that strained across her heavy breasts. Matteo provided her with strong espresso, catered meals from five-star restaurants, and complete, unbothered silence. By the dawn of the third day, her eyes were burning, but her heart was racing with the thrill of the hunt. She had cross-referenced the encrypted Cayman Island wire transfers against the operational expenses of Aegis Financial Holdings. The thief was brilliant, using a highly sophisticated algorithmic skimming technique known in the dark web as salami slicing, taking undetectable fractions of pennies from millions of transactions and routing them through dummy corporations in Delaware. But the thief had made one arrogant mistake. They had tied a secondary dummy corporation to a holding company that leased a private luxury yacht berthed at Chelsea Piers. Abigail printed the final chain of evidence, the paper warm in her hands. She marched out of the office, her bare feet padding softly against the cold marble. She found Matteo in the kitchen, drinking black coffee, wearing nothing but low-slung sweatpants that displayed his heavily tattooed, muscular torso. She slapped the 50-page dossier onto the granite island. "I found your rat," Abigail said, her chest heaving with exhaustion and triumph. Matteo set his mug down slowly. He didn't look at the paper. He looked at her flushed, round face, her messy hair, and the fire blazing in her eyes. "Alistair Hayes," Abigail declared, watching Matteo's jaw instantly lock into a furious granite line. "Your chief financial officer." The name hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Alistair Hayes was not just the chief financial officer of Aegis Financial Holdings. He was Matteo Bianchi's most trusted advisor, a man who had stood by the Bianchi family for 2 decades. Matteo's dark eyes narrowed to lethal slits. He picked up the dossier, his massive fingers tracing the undeniable paper trail Abigail had meticulously compiled. The Delaware shell corporations, the fractional skimming algorithms, the leased yacht at Chelsea Piers. It was all there, in black and white. "Are you absolutely certain?" Matteo's voice was dangerously quiet, a low rumble that promised impending violence. "Math doesn't lie, Matteo," Abigail replied, crossing her thick arms under her bust. "Hayes has siphoned almost $4.2 million over the last 6 weeks. He's preparing to run. The yacht's mooring fees were paid in advance for the next 3 days, but the offshore accounts associated with it were liquidated at midnight. He's liquidating his assets." Matteo stared at the paper for a long, suffocating minute before looking up at her. The murderous rage in his eyes slowly morphed into a look of profound, dark admiration. He stepped around the kitchen island, closing the distance between them until Abigail was backed against the cold refrigerator door. "You are extraordinary," he murmured, raising a hand to brush a stray lock of hair from her flushed, round cheek. His thumb lingered, tracing the soft fullness of her jawline. "Alistair has covered his tracks from the best forensic auditors on the eastern seaboard, and you dismantled him in 2 days." Abigail swallowed hard, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I did what you asked. I paid my father's debt. Now let me go." Matteo let out a dark, velvety chuckle. "Let you go? Oh, mia cara, you profoundly misunderstand the situation. You haven't paid the debt. You've merely proven your worth. And tonight, you are going to help me deliver the consequences." Panic flared in her chest. "What do you mean?" "Tonight is the annual charity gala for the New York Commerce Guild at Cipriani Wall Street," Matteo stated, stepping back and pulling a sleek black smartphone from his pocket. "Alistair will be there, playing the role of the loyal CFO. You will attend by my side. You will smile, you will look magnificent, and you will watch as I tear his life apart." "I am not a mafia wife," Abigail snapped, her temper finally boiling over. "I don't go to galas with mob bosses, and I certainly don't have anything to wear to a place like Cipriani." "That," Matteo smiled, his eyes dropping to her generous curves with that familiar possessive heat, "is already taken care of." 5 hours later, Abigail stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the guest bedroom, entirely unable to recognize the woman staring back at her. Matteo had summoned a private styling team. They had wrestled her thick, unruly hair into an elegant, cascading updo and applied makeup that made her dark eyes pop and her lips look impossibly full. But it was the dress that left her breathless. It was a custom-made, deep emerald silk gown that draped flawlessly over her 240-pound frame. It featured a sweetheart neckline that aggressively showcased her heavy cleavage, a corseted waist that smoothed and accentuated her plush curves, and a dangerous thigh-high slit. For the first time in her life, Abigail didn't feel like a woman trying to hide her size. She looked like a goddess who demanded worship. When she walked out into the living room, Matteo was waiting. He wore a devastatingly sharp black tuxedo, looking every inch the ruthless king of the underworld. When he saw her, he stopped dead. The smug, arrogant mask slipped entirely, replaced by a look of raw, unadulterated awe. He crossed the room slowly, his eyes burning with a dark fire. He stopped inches from her, reaching out to lightly trace the bare skin of her collarbone. "You are a magnificent creature, Abigail," he whispered huskily, offering his arm. "Let us go hunt a traitor." Cipriani Wall Street was a cathedral of Greek revival architecture, its massive limestone columns bathed in golden light. The grand ballroom was packed with Manhattan's elite, politicians, hedge fund managers, and men who operated comfortably in the violent grey areas of the law. The moment Matteo and Abigail entered, The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Eyes tracked them. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Abigail felt the weight of their judgment. They were looking at the notorious mob boss and the fat, unknown woman on his arm. But Matteo didn't hide her. He kept a proprietary, heavy hand firmly on the small of her back, practically daring anyone to look at her with disrespect. "There he is," Matteo murmured, leaning close to her ear. Abigail followed his gaze to the VIP section, near the towering marble bar. Alistair Hayes was a silver-haired, distinguished-looking man in his late 50s, laughing heartily with a state senator. "I need to speak with the senator," Matteo said smoothly, his hand trailing down to squeeze her hip. "Wait by the bar, Abigail. Do not move. Do not speak to anyone." Before she could protest, Matteo slipped into the crowd. Abigail stood awkwardly by the bar, ordering a club soda to give her trembling hands something to hold. Well, I must admit, I didn't expect Matteo to bring a +1, let alone someone with such generous proportions. Abigail froze, turning slowly. Alistair Hayes was standing right beside her, a smug, oily smile on his face. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her chest with sleazy intent. "I'm his new auditor," Abigail said coldly, refusing to shrink under his gaze. Alistair chuckled, taking a sip of his martini. "An auditor? How quaint. I suppose Matteo needed someone desperate. Tell me, Miss Brooks, how is Arthur doing?" Abigail's blood ran instantly cold. Her grip on her glass tightened until her knuckles turned white. "How do you know my father's name?" Alistair leaned in, his voice dropping to a malicious whisper. "Because, my dear, your father didn't just borrow money from us. He was laundering it for me. Arthur Brooks is the one who set up the shell companies in Delaware." The world tilted on its axis. The air left Abigail's lungs in a violent rush. "Matteo thinks he holds all the cards," Alistair sneered, his eyes glittering with malice. "But your father is the key to bringing down the entire Bianchi empire, and if Matteo touches me tonight, the feds receive a very detailed ledger that your pathetic father personally signed." Before Abigail could even process the catastrophic revelation, a massive, familiar hand clamped down onto Alistair's shoulder with bone-crushing force. "Alistair," Matteo's voice purred behind them, dripping with lethal intent. "I hope you aren't boring my date with your creative accounting theories." Alistair Hayes flinched, the smugness instantly draining from his aristocratic face as Matteo Bianchi's heavy hand anchored him in place. The pressure was subtle enough to go unnoticed by the surrounding crowd of socialites and politicians, but Abigail could see the way Alistair's knees buckled slightly under the sheer, punishing force. "Matteo," Alistair gasped, recovering his composure with a strained, artificial smile. "I was just getting acquainted with your stunning new associate." "You are a remarkably bold man, Alistair," Matteo murmured, his voice a smooth, venomous purr. He leaned in, his dark eyes devoid of any warmth. "To steal from me is a fatal error. To threaten the woman standing by my side in public? That is a special kind of suicide. Let us take a walk. We have business to conclude." Without waiting for an answer, Matteo gripped Alistair by the elbow, steering the older man away from the crowded bar. He didn't look back, but he extended his free hand toward Abigail. She took it without hesitation, her plump fingers trembling slightly as they wrapped around his firm, warm grip. Together, they navigated the glittering ballroom, slipping past the velvet ropes and into the quiet, dimly lit corridor that led to Cipriani's private wine cellars. The moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them, sealing away the classical music and the chatter of the elite. The illusion of civility vanished entirely. Matteo shoved Alistair hard against the cold stone wall of the cellar. The CFO stumbled, his martini glass shattering against the floor, splashing expensive gin over his polished Oxfords. Two of Matteo's men, silent, massive shadows, who had been tailing them all night, stepped out from the darkness, locking the cellar doors and standards guard. "You think you can just eliminate me, Matteo?" Alistair spat, straightening his tailored jacket, though his chest heaved with panic. "If I don't check in with my attorney by midnight, the feds get everything. The dummy corporations, the wire transfers, the encrypted ledgers." "You are bluffing," Matteo said coldly, stepping into Alistair's personal space. "You are a parasite, Alistair. Parasites do not destroy their hosts unless they have a new one lined up. And I know for a fact you haven't secured immunity." "I don't need immunity," Alistair laughed, a desperate, wild sound. He pointed a shaking finger at Abigail, who stood frozen in her breathtaking emerald gown. "Ask her. Ask the brilliant auditor you brought into your bed. Ask her whose signature is on the master documents for the Delaware shells." Abigail felt the blood rush in her ears, a deafening roar that drowned out the hum of the cellar's climate control. "He's lying," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My father is a fool, a gambling addict, but he is not a criminal mastermind. He doesn't even know how to use a VPN, let alone establish a multinational laundering front." "Oh, Abigail," Alistair sneered, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "Your father is an exceptional actor. He came to me 2 years ago, begging for capital to save his dying logistics company. I gave it to him, but in exchange he used his commercial freight licenses to move our less legal assets across state lines. When he got greedy and started skimming to feed his baccarat habit, I caught him. I made him the fall guy. He signed the ledgers, Abigail. If I go down, Arthur Brooks goes to federal prison for the rest of his miserable life, and the Bianchi family goes down with him." The betrayal hit Abigail like a physical blow to the stomach. Her legs felt weak, her heavy curves swaying as she took a step back, clutching the cold stone of a wine rack for support. Arthur. Her father hadn't been a victim of the Bianchi family. He had been a willing participant, a smuggler, and a thief. He had allowed Abigail to offer herself as collateral, perfectly aware that she was stepping into the den of the very monsters he had conspired with. He had sold her out to save his own skin. A profound, shattering silence descended upon the cellar. Matteo did not move. He did not yell. He slowly turned his head to look at Abigail. He saw the devastation fracturing her beautiful, expressive face, the way her chest heaved beneath the emerald silk as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. And then, something extraordinary happened. The brilliant, pragmatic mind of Abigail Brooks snapped into sharp focus, cutting through the grief with the precision of a scalpel. "You don't have the ledgers," Abigail said, pushing herself off the wine rack. Her voice was no longer trembling. It was low, hard, and resonant. Alistair blinked, momentarily thrown. "Excuse me, you don't have the physical ledgers," Abigail repeated, stepping forward until she was standing right beside Matteo. She looked at the pathetic, sweating CFO with utter disdain. "You're a digital thief, Alistair. I tracked your salami-slicing algorithm. It's elegant, but it requires a closed-loop system. If my father signed physical documents, master ledgers linking the freight licenses to the Delaware shells, you wouldn't digitize them. They're too dangerous to put on a server that could be hacked. You made him keep the hard copies." Alistair's face paled, the smugness completely evaporating. Abigail turned to Matteo, her dark eyes blazing with a fierce, unapologetic intelligence. "He doesn't have the leverage, Matteo. My father has it. Alistair is trying to extort you with a weapon he isn't even holding." Matteo's lips curled into a slow, terrifying smile. He looked at Abigail not as a captive, nor as a beautiful distraction, but as a queen who had just handed him the enemy's head on a silver platter. "Is that true, Alistair?" Matteo asked, pulling a sleek, silver-suppressed pistol from beneath his tuxedo jacket. Alistair dropped to his knees, his hands raised in surrender, the tailored suit suddenly looking like a clown's costume. "Matteo, please, take him to the warehouse in Red Hook," Matteo ordered his men, his voice devoid of emotion. "Keep him alive. I want to know exactly how much he stole before I balance his account." The massive enforcers dragged the sobbing CFO out the back exit of the cellar. Left alone in the dim light, the adrenaline suddenly abandoned Abigail. The room spun. She swayed, her heavy form pitching forward, but Matteo was there. He caught her effortlessly, his strong arms wrapping around her thick waist, pulling her flush against the solid wall of his chest. The ride back to the Jenga tower was cloaked in heavy, suffocating silence. Rain had begun to fall again, streaking the tinted windows of the Maybach with neon reflections of the city. Abigail sat curled into the corner of the plush leather seat, her emerald gown pooling around her wide hips. She stared blankly at the glass, a single tear cutting a hot path down her powdered cheek. Her entire life had been built on a lie. She had sacrificed her savings, her peace of mind, and ultimately her freedom for a man who had manipulated her at every turn. Arthur Brooks wasn't just a failure, he was a coward of the highest order. A heavy, warm hand suddenly blanketed her thigh. Abigail jumped, turning her head to find Matteo watching her. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket and undone the first 3 buttons of his crisp white shirt, revealing the dark ink of his tattoos. The predatory, smug aura that usually surrounded him was gone, replaced by a quiet, intense gravity. "Do not weep for him," Matteo commanded softly, his thumb gently stroking the soft curve of her thigh through the silk of her dress. It was a grounding touch, anchoring her to reality. "He does not deserve your tears, Abigail. He never deserved a daughter like you." "I gave him everything," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I was saving him from you, but he was one of you all along." "He was never one of us," Matteo corrected, his jaw tightening. "We have a code. We protect our family. Arthur used his family as a shield. There is a profound difference." He leaned closer, the scent of bergamot and expensive whiskey washing over her. He gently cupped her jaw, his large hand dwarfing her round face. He tipped her head back, forcing her to meet his intense, dark gaze. "You belong to me now," Matteo murmured, the words no longer a threat, but a fierce, protective vow. "And I protect what is mine. No one will ever use you again. Not Alistair, not the feds, and certainly not Arthur." The raw, possessive heat in his eyes ignited a sudden, terrifying fire in Abigail's chest. For the first time, she didn't want to pull away. She leaned into his touch, her breath hitching as his thumb brushed over her full lower lip. "We have to find the ledger," Abigail said, forcing her mind back to the crisis at hand, though her heart was pounding furiously against her ribs. "If Alistair doesn't have it, my father hid it. He's paranoid. He wouldn't keep something that incriminating at the logistics office. I audited that building myself. There's no safe." Matteo's eyes darkened with respect. Even in the midst of heartbreak, her brilliant mind was working. Where would a paranoid coward hide a physical book that guarantees his life? Abigail closed her eyes, sifting through 26 years of memories, searching for the anomaly. When I was a teenager, before the logistics company went under, he bought an old, rusted-out auto body shop in Greenpoint. He told my mother it was an investment property, but he never developed it. He just paid the property taxes every year, religious about it. Even when we couldn't afford groceries, he paid the taxes on that useless garage. A secondary location, Matteo mused, a dangerous smile touching his lips. He tapped the glass partition separating them from the driver. Change of plans. We are going to Greenpoint. The Maybach tore through the wet streets of Brooklyn, pulling up to a desolate, graffiti-covered garage nestled under the shadow of the Kosciuszko Bridge. The area was completely abandoned, lit only by the sickly orange glow of a single street lamp. Matteo ordered his men to secure the perimeter before stepping out of the car. He turned and offered his hand to Abigail. This time, she took it. She stepped out into the damp chill of the night, the heavy emerald silk of her gown brushing against the cracked pavement. The heavy corrugated metal door of the garage was secured with a heavy-duty padlock, but one of Matteo's men dispatched it in seconds with a pair of bolt cutters. The door groaned upward, revealing a cavernous, pitch-black space, smelling of old motor oil and decay. Matteo pulled a tactical flashlight from his enforcer and stepped inside, pulling Abigail close to his side. His free hand rested casually on the grip of the pistol tucked into his waistband. The beam of light swept over rusted car parts, stacks of rotting tires, and finally, nestled in the far corner beneath a heavy tarp, a massive, antique Diebold safe. Bingo, Abigail breathed, her heart racing. They approached the safe. It was an old mechanical dial, the kind that required a physical combination, completely impervious to digital hacking. Can you open it? Matteo asked, looking down at her. Abigail stared at the brass dial. My father is a creature of habit. He only uses numbers that mean something to him. She knelt awkwardly in her gown, her thick thighs pressing against the cold concrete. She reached out, her fingers resting on the cold metal. She tried his birthday. Nothing. She tried her mother's anniversary. The dial wouldn't budge. She paused, a sickening realization washing over her. She spun the dial, entering the date he had lost his first major logistics contract, the day he first stepped into an underground casino. Click. The heavy tumblers fell into place. Abigail grabbed the brass handle and pulled. The heavy door swung open with a metallic groan. Inside, resting on a single metal shelf, was a thick, black, leather-bound ledger. She reached out to grab it, but a sudden, deafening gunshot shattered the silence of the garage. Sparks flew as a bullet ricocheted off the steel casing of the safe, mere inches from Abigail's head. Matteo reacted with terrifying speed. He grabbed Abigail by the waist, violently hauling her heavy frame behind the thick steel door of the safe for cover as a barrage of automatic gunfire rained down upon them from the shadows near the entrance. Well, well, well. A harsh, unfamiliar voice echoed through the dark garage over the ringing in Abigail's ears. Alistair said you'd figure it out eventually, Bianchi. But he paid us a hell of a lot of money to make sure you never leave this garage with that book. The deafening roar of automatic gunfire tore through the damp, subterranean air of the Greenpoint garage. Concrete dust exploded above their heads as bullets chewed through the cinder-block wall behind the heavy Diebold safe. Matteo's arm was a band of iron across Abigail's chest, crushing her back against the cold steel of the safe door. He shielded her completely, using his massive muscular frame to absorb any potential shrapnel. "Stay down!" Matteo roared over the relentless barrage. He didn't wait for her to answer. In one fluid, lethal motion, he drew his silver-suppressed pistol, leaned out from their meager cover, and fired 3 precise shots into the darkness. A sharp cry of pain echoed from the entrance, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the oil-stained concrete. "Spread out! Flank them!" yelled a gritty, heavily accented voice from the shadows. "Alistair paid for the book, and he paid double for Bianchi's head. Get moving, Donovan! Cover the left!" Abigail's heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She was a forensic auditor, a woman who found absolute peace in the quiet, predictable order of numbers and spreadsheets. The smell of burning cordite and copper blood was entirely alien to her. Yet as she crouched in her ruined emerald gown, her thick thighs trembling against the freezing floor, a strange, profound clarity washed over her. She looked at Matteo. His bespoke white shirt was smeared with concrete dust, his dark eyes narrowed in lethal concentration. He was checking his magazine, calculating his odds with the same cold pragmatism she used to balance an impossible ledger. He was a monster to the rest of the world, but right now, he was standing between her and certain death. "Bennett!" Matteo shouted into his earpiece, trying to reach the enforcers he had stationed outside. Static hissed back at him. The mercenaries had jammed their comms. "It is just us, Abigail. When I move, you stay behind this safe. Do not move unless I tell you." "There are too many of them," Abigail whispered, her voice tight with panic. She peeked around the bottom edge of the safe. Through the gloom, she could see 3 heavily armed men advancing down the center aisle, using rusted car chassis for cover. "I have survived worse odds," Matteo said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. He reached down, his calloused hand briefly gripping the soft, plush curve of her hip. It was a grounding touch, a silent promise. "I will not let them touch you." Matteo spun out from cover, firing a rapid succession of shots that forced the advancing mercenaries to duck behind a crumbling Ford Mustang. But another mercenary, a towering man holding a shotgun, had climbed atop a stack of heavy industrial tires on their right flank. He racked the slide, aiming directly down at Matteo's exposed back. "Matteo, above you!" Abigail screamed. Without thinking, driven by a primal surge of pure adrenaline, Abigail threw her weight forward. She wasn't a small, fragile woman. She was a formidable force. She slammed her heavy shoulder into a towering cast-iron tool chest, resting precariously on rusted casters beside the safe. The sheer momentum and power of her 240-pound frame sent the massive chest hurtling forward. It violently crashed into the stack of tires just as the mercenary pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast went wildly off target, shattering the ceiling lights above them. The mercenary lost his balance, tumbling backward off the tires and hitting the concrete with a sickening crunch. Matteo didn't waste the opening. He pivoted smoothly, firing 2 rounds into the center of the chest of the closest advancing gunman, dropping him instantly. The remaining mercenary, Donovan, panicked. Seeing his team decimated in seconds, he scrambled backward, abandoning the contract and sprinting out into the rainy Brooklyn night. Silence descended, heavy and ringing. The only sound was the steady drip of rainwater leaking through the bullet holes in the corrugated roof. Matteo slowly lowered his weapon. He didn't pursue the runner. Instead, he dropped to his knees in front of Abigail. His hands were frantic, practically tearing at the heavy silk of her emerald gown, searching for blood, for bullet holes, for any sign that he had failed to protect her. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his voice thick with a raw, terrifying panic she had never heard before. His dark eyes searched her face frantically. "Abigail, speak to me. Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," She gasped, her hands coming up to grasp his broad shoulders. She was trembling violently, the adrenaline crashing. "I'm okay, Matteo. I'm not shot." Matteo let out a ragged breath. He closed his eyes, his forehead dropping to rest against her soft, heaving cleavage. He stayed there for a long moment, simply breathing her in. Then he looked up, his gaze filled with a burning, absolute devotion that made the breath catch in her throat. "You saved my life," he whispered, his hands sliding up to cup her flushed, round face. "You magnificent, beautiful, brilliant woman. You saved me." He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, polite kiss. It was a fierce, consuming collision of mouths, fueled by the intoxicating high of survival. Abigail groaned, entirely surrendering to the heat of him. Her plump hands tangled in his thick, dark hair as his tongue swept into her mouth, tasting of expensive whiskey and danger. His large hands gripped her wide hips, pulling her heavy, gorgeous curves flush against his hard, muscular body, completely ignoring the dirt and the danger surrounding them. When they finally broke apart, both gasping for air, Matteo rested his forehead against hers. He turned his head slightly, his eyes locking onto the black leather ledger, resting inside the open safe. He stood up, pulling Abigail to her feet with effortless strength. He reached into the safe and pulled out the book. It was heavy, practically pulsating with the dark secrets of 100 corrupt men. Matteo flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the meticulous, handwritten columns. He stopped halfway through. "Here," Matteo murmured softly. "Arthur Brooks, the Master Logistics Manifest, linking his company to Alistair's offshore accounts." Abigail stared at her father's signature. It was the absolute proof of his guilt, the chains that bound her to a man who had sold her soul to save his own. Matteo didn't hesitate. He gripped the pages in his massive fist and violently ripped them out of the spine. He pulled a sleek silver lighter from his pocket, flicked the flame, and held it to the corner of the paper. They stood together in the dim, smoky garage, watching as her father's sins curled into black ash and fluttered to the damp concrete floor. "Alistair's crimes remain in the book," Matteo said quietly, tossing the burning remnants aside. He turned to face her, his expression utterly serious. "But Arthur's ledger is burned. The debt is zeroed out. The leverage is gone." Abigail stared at the ashes. "What does that mean?" "It means," Matteo said, his voice dropping to a low, painful whisper, "that you are free, Abigail. You do not belong to me anymore. You can walk out of this garage, return to your firm, and never see me again." He stood perfectly still, offering her the one thing he desperately wanted to deny her. Abigail looked at the ashes, and then she looked up at the ruthless Mafia Boss standing before her. She saw the blood on his hands, the danger in his world, and the terrifying, unconditional love burning in his dark eyes. He had bought her. He had terrified her. But ultimately, he was the only man who had ever truly seen her. "You're a brilliant businessman, Matteo," Abigail whispered, stepping forward until her lush breasts brushed against his chest. She reached up, tracing his jawline. "But you're a terrible accountant. You zeroed out the old debt, but you forgot about the new one." Matteo's breath hitched. "What new debt?" Abigail smiled, a confident, radiant expression that lit up the darkness of the garage. "You owe me your life, and I plan on collecting." Will Abigail and Matteo's fiery, dangerous romance survive the treacherous underworld of New York City? Or will the shadows of the Bianchi crime syndicate eventually consume them both? This thrilling tale, of a brilliant, curvy accountant and a ruthless mafia boss proves that sometimes the most unexpected collateral becomes the ultimate prize. If you loved this intense story of dark secrets, breathless action, and undeniable chemistry, don't let the story end here. Smash that like button, share this video with all your romance-loving friends, and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping, high-stakes mafia romance stories.